We're starting on chapter 22, which is oxygen and carbon dioxide physiology. The objectives for today are to be able to define partial pressure and be able to calculate the partial pressure of gas in an air or concentration in water. To be able to describe how salinity and temperature affects the solubility of a gas, and then to predict the movement of a dissolved gas by knowing the partial pressure of that gas. The total pressure exerted by a mixture of gases is actually the sum of the partial pressure of each individual gas in the mixture. So what that means is if we have oxygen, nitrogen, argon, carbon dioxide, each of them are going to exert partial pressure, and it's all going to add up to the total pressure. So here you can see the total pressure is 1 atmosphere. 1 ATM stands for atmosphere, and each of them exert partial pressure. So since we have 20.95% oxygen, it exerts about 0.2095 atmospheres of pressure. You might have learned the ideal gas law in chemistry, which says that PV equals nRT, which means pressure times volume is equal to the moles times the ideal gas constant times temperature. So that's the ideal gas law. You're turning in a sheet to go with this video, and I want you to practice calculating partial pressures. So what partial pressure is, takes the percent or mole fraction of the gas times the total pressure, and you'll get the partial pressure. So since we have 1 atmosphere of total pressure and we have 20.95% oxygen, you just multiply those together and you find out that the partial pressure of oxygen is 0.2095 atmospheres. So you're going to solve that. I know I actually have the answers on the previous page, but I want you to show me how you solve that to practice it for the test. Okay, the next formula you're going to need to know, and I'll give you these formulas on the test, but I need you to be able to practice using them, is to calculate the concentration of each of these dissolved gases based on the absorbance coefficient of each one. So using the partial pressures from the previous slide, which would be P sub x, and giving you the absorbance coefficient on this slide, here the absorbance coefficient of carbon dioxide is 77. I want you to tell me how much dissolved gas would be in distilled water. Okay, I don't know if you've already done the calculations or you're waiting until the end of the video to go back and do those calculations, but there's 2 more variables I want you to understand. Remember, the ideal gas law is PV equals nRT. So the question is, how does temperature and salinity affect the solubility of a gas? So if you look here and you take a sealed sample bottle of Cold Creek water, after it is cold and then sits out and starts to warm up in a warmer room, you'll see that the gas is less soluble, which is why some bubbles start to form, because you have a lot more gas soluble when it's colder, and then as the temperature raises, the temperature drives the dissolved gases out of solution. The same thing goes for salinity. If you add a little bit of salt to a carbonated beverage, it's actually going to make more gas come out of solution. So a carbonated beverage, you've added a bunch of carbon dioxide into it. But if you put more salt in it, it's going to start bubbling more, showing us that as the temperature goes up or the salinity goes up, we're going to have less dissolved gas. Okay, these are 2 more problems you're going to need to turn in. And even if you don't get the right answer, I really just want you to try it. You'll get full credit for actually making an attempt to try it. I want you to calculate the salinity effect on oxygen in water. So the idea here is that you're showing me how salt in this water affects how well oxygen dissolves. And then I want you to calculate the effect of temperature on oxygen concentration of water, showing me how oxygen dissolves better or worse as the temperature of the water goes up. I have a 2-minute video on Populi that shows how the water beetle works, and it basically uses this oxygen or this gas bubble as a little scuba tank. And the idea here is that it has oxygen in the gas bubble that is at a lower partial pressure than oxygen in the water or oxygen in the atmosphere. And the principle you're trying to understand from this video is the fundamental law of gas diffusion. Gas diffuses from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. So since oxygen in the gas bubble is 0.1 atmospheres compared to oxygen in the water, which is 0.21 atmospheres, oxygen will diffuse into that gas bubble. And then you got to go watch the video to see how that oxygen allows the water beetle to stay underwater, even though it doesn't have gills, for about 30 minutes and act like a mini scuba tank. All right, I want you to start thinking about your fictional animal project and the respiratory system. We have a variety of different respiratory systems. Some have unidirectional flow. Others have tidal flow, which is what we as humans have. And finally, some animals just have cutaneous diffusion. The example they give you here is of an anchovy larva that doesn't actually have a developed lung or gill system, so oxygen diffuses directly through its skin. Human respiratory system is a tidal flow method, which means we just bulk breathe in air, and then oxygen diffuses from our alveoli into our blood, and specifically into our red blood cells, where it's carried by hemoglobin. And then we transport it to our muscles, where again it diffuses from an area of high pressure to lower pressure into our muscle cells, specifically the mitochondria. That's how it works. So again, this is called tidal flow or tidal breathing, which is what our lungs do. But it's going to basically flow via convection first and then diffusion. Convection is just pulling in a whole bunch of air. Diffusion, then, it goes from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. So if you look at the partial pressure of oxygen throughout our blood, you can see that ambient air, you have a lot higher partial pressure. Since oxygen is about 20%, it's going to be about 0.2 atmospheres. And then it flows from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So it goes then into the alveoli or alveolar gas. Alveoli are the little bubbles in our lungs that at the very end of our lungs. And then it goes from the alveoli to the blood. And then the lungs are bathed with arterial blood, meaning they have arteries surrounding them. And then it goes from the arteries to all of our systemic blood and then into our mitochondria. This is called the physiological oxygen cascade. The idea is that oxygen is going to flow down its partial pressure. It's going to go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Okay, that's it for this chapter, chapter 22. Be sure to answer the questions on the handout and turn them in for credit for watching this video.